Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ramadan Mubarak. Welcome back to the Healthy Muslim in Ramadan. I want finally to take you from the rich teaching that we've had from the time of the Prophet into the extraordinary development of medicine in the 2 centuries that followed the conquest of the Arab lands. Islam invented medicine, not the simple medicine of traditional healing and so on. That's been known all over the world everywhere because it is human to take medicine. It's the one thing that distinguishes man from the animals, as William Osler said rather sarcastically. But we should be proud of what Islam achieved in those days. I say it because as a new Muslim, as a convert Muslim, I've come slowly to appreciate what adherence to the Quran and Sunnah achieves in a human being in terms of his ability to be effective, to be a leader, to discover things and apply them, to develop systems, to develop communities in which things are applied. And the development in that golden age of Islam was really remarkable. Of course, there had been great civilizations. The Chinese civilization was awesome. The Egyptian civilization was awesome. But Europe was still in the Dark Ages. There was nothing to compare with the genuinely new advances and applications of scientific thought that was created in Islam in those days. Nothing in the Chinese civilization, nothing in the Egyptian civilization, or indeed in other ones. What the Muslims were able to do was to be fascinated with what they saw as truth. That in science they discovered God. In science they discovered the truth of the creation. They respected it, developed it, and applied it. So the Islamic approach to medicine was always an affirmation of Tawheed, which formed the core of its practitioners' spiritual beliefs. And many of them were alim, were scholars in Quran and jurisprudence, as well as in philosophy and other dialectic sciences. What was clear was, like at the time of the Prophet, the entirety of the individual human being was studied, not merely a part or a split off bit of his chemistry, but his entire human personality. And the man in his sickness was seen in the context of his creational reality, that it was part of his destiny to be sick at this time. There was a spiritual meaning to what he was going through. All of this led to a very profound learning, which was written down and much valued by the people who, from the West, who came to learn it from the Arabic text, so much so that the first books, that many of the texts were translated into Latin, and the first Arab books to be printed, the Latin translations to be printed, were indeed textbooks of medicine. That's really, really what people wanted. Even when entire Islamic libraries were burned in later times, the textbooks of medicine were preserved. This was, of course, holistic medicine. We've lost it and we're trying to rediscover it. Scholarship was awesome. Books were written with difficulty. It was written by longhand. They didn't have typewriters. But we're lucky that many texts, whether in their original or in their Latin translations, have been preserved. So we've got an idea of who was around at that time. We have Al-Razi, who died in 925, the great Ibn Sina, who I've already spoken about, the father of modern medicine, without doubt, the giant of his time. At-Zarawi, Ibn al-Nafis, Ali ibn Abbas al-Majusi. These were very, very important people, but some of them quite early specialized. Yohanna al-Mustawi, 777 to 857, practiced dissection and regarded the beauty that he discovered in learning the anatomy of the body was a revelation of the wisdom of the divine, and wrote a very important treatise on anatomy, which was, like Gray's Anatomy today, the reference work for surgeons for hundreds and hundreds of years later. His pupil, who was a Christian, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, translated Hippocrates and Galen into Latin and into from the Greek into Latin and into Arabic. So the Arabic physicians who couldn't understand Greek were fully conversant and absorbed all the wisdom of the great Greek scholars. Sadly, the originals of Hippocrates are lost, but the Arabic translations were preserved. Interesting that we have forgotten the great Islamic scholars, but we've remembered Hippocrates and Galen, even though we wouldn't have known about them if the Arabic scholars hadn't translated it. Ibn Ishaq was an ophthalmologist. So what? He did the first cataract operation. At a time when England was a collection of peasants in straw huts, they devised these beautiful surgical instruments for a variety of fine procedures and were able to extract a cataract and restore sight. Ibn al-Nafis discovered the circulation of the blood. Now, some of you might wake up at this point and think, hey, you got that wrong. William Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood in England in the 18th century. Actually, he didn't. Ibn al-Nafis was in Damascus in 1288, and an Egyptian student studying in Germany discovered his writings, and very clearly he described properly what we now know as the circulation of the blood, and that was in 1924. And rather reluctantly, a few people are starting to grudgingly admit that at the end of the day, unfortunately, the Muslims got it right. It wasn't just the discoveries. They realized they had to train people, and they organized the first ever medical school in Baghdad in 754 under the Caliph Mansur. This was not just a group of people sitting on the ground under a tree discussing philosophy. This was a proper university where people were doing research, where they were accountable for their ideas, had to justify their opinions, and subject themselves to criticism. The scientific method was beginning. It was no longer my opinion, the way I prepare this medicine is this and mine is better than yours. You had to prove it. And the beginning of real science started in Baghdad. At that time, in this medical school, they also started to have proper pharmacies with apothecaries who were all they did was the study of medicine. These were people who traveled and who brought increasingly new and varied medicines from other countries. In 1248, there was an Arabic herbal, a textbook of herbal, different herbs and different flowers by Ibn al-Baytar, who mentioned 800 herbs. these were used regularly, and the different properties were understood, and whether you had to crush them, whether you had to get the distilled spirit. Because remember, by now, chemistry had started and distillation happened. Once things could be distilled, the essence of a herb could be concentrated in a way that increased its benefit, and just crushing something was not enough. You could get the essence of a large bunch of herbs distilled into a few drops. This transformed our understanding of the strength and power and quality that you had to achieve when you were looking for treatment. Some of the medicines that were used were traditional. Senna and saffron was used at the time of the Prophet, but new ones came in: tamarind, fennel, licorice, distilled rosewater, and gold leaf. Remember, the Islamic community was now wealthy, and man will use money in the service of his health anytime he can. And it's sweet to see that gold leaf was quickly introduced for healing. Whether it was beneficial, I don't know. We don't use it anymore. Please come back after the break. This is fun. Welcome back. I'm glad to be able to sing the praises of the Islamic physicians soon after the time of the Prophet. This was a golden age of science, not just Islamic science, but of science full stop. The Muslims were the kings of the world in terms of their learning and understanding of science and how they applied it. They made inroads into mathematics, astrology, language, and all of these, chemistry, physics, all of these sciences came together in the service of medicine. Cordoba was in Spain, although at the far fringe of the empire, became a hub for every single exercise of learning, whether it was jurisprudence, philosophy, law, or the practice of medicine. Not only were the Muslims excited by their new developments, but they were deeply connected to the Christians and the Jews of that time. Maimonides was the father of Jewish medicine, and there were strong Christian physicians at the time. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, was the most famous Muslim physician of his time, not as famous as Ibn Sina, even though he himself wrote a very important book, the Kitab al-Kulliyat fi al-Tib, a general reference on medicine, which was translated into Latin and Hebrew. So it shows the connection between the Muslims, the Christians, and the Jews. Ibn Rushd was not only a physician, he was also a judge, and he was the personal physician of the governor of Cordoba. Everybody was at peace in those days, and there was such easy intercommunication and respect between the three faiths. In Ibn Rushd's book, reading it, you think, hey, this could be any modern textbook. He starts off with anatomy. He then goes on to physiology, describing the functions of different organs. He then describes diseases that can come to the body, diseases from tumours, diseases from infection, and so on, diseases of the circulation. He then describes what the patients look like when they suffer from these diseases, what we would call clinical syndromes. He then describes healthcare, how to keep healthy, how to help the sick, and specific treatments for different illnesses, with medication, with diet, and with spiritual healing. Spiritual healing then was a normal and easy, accepted treatment of the sick. The respect for anatomy was absolute. And Ibn Rushd said, "Who practices autopsy, his faith in God increases." By this time, of course, the Islamic world was wealthy. You only have to look at the architecture of Cordoba, what is left of it in Spain now, to wonder at the aesthetic brilliance of the Muslims at that time. By this time, hospitals were funded by the state. Not just medical schools, which were started in Baghdad, but hospitals. And the state saw it as their duty to look after the sick. They didn't charge for it. It wasn't a problem of having insurance. It was your right as a human to have the state be concerned about your health. By the 12th and 13th centuries, they were fully developed, with lecture halls, separate facilities for men and women, pharmacies, laboratories, and libraries. People would stay for a long time. They had rest, they had music, they had massage. It wasn't just treatment with a physiotherapist and with some medicine. There were many other ways by which they were helped back into health, not least by a deep understanding of who they were as an individual, and the illness was seen in the totality of its setting of that person at that time in their life. In Egypt in the 11th century, there were the first hospitals for the compassionate care of the mentally sick. Remember what Ingenen was like in the 19th century. We had a lunatic asylum that was described as bedlam. People were given coarse clothing and they were allowed to sit in their natural excretions without being washed. They were chained. When they screamed too much, iced water was thrown over them, or they were immersed in an iced bath. Compare that to the 11th century, 8 centuries earlier. There were gardens, there were fountains, there was lute music, there was massage, there was fragrance, there was very careful attention paid to the cleanliness, nutrition, and comfort of the individuals who were troubled. And there were 10 attendants for each patient. I urge somebody in the Islamic world to build that hospital again, in all its specifications. And I will volunteer willingly to be the first patient. I'm obviously crazy. I can't wait to have that treatment. Now people fear going to psychiatrists. They fear what might happen if they have the treatments that are being recommended with strong drugs and electric shock and brain neurosurgery. What will emerge at the end of those treatments? Will it be me? Will the person I know myself to be still be there? It's a deep fear of many people entering treatment today. My hero Ibn Sina, his work was used until the 18th century. And was quoted even quite late, because he had distinguished between the causes, diagnosis, and treatment of smallpox. This work inspired a 17th century Turkish Muslim who started vaccination. Hello! Didn't Jenner discover vaccination in the 19th century? Nope. It was a Turkish physician in the 17th century. And we know that for sure because an intrepid and totally crazy aristocratic woman called Lady Mary Montagu went over to Turkey and had her son vaccinated at that time, a full 2 centuries before Edward Jenner. But when she tried to introduce these ideas in England when she returned, she was laughed at. Of course, people always laugh at women. That is par for the course. In Baghdad, environmental health and lifestyle was absolutely known to be fundamental to the effective healing of an individual, and physicians would work within the patient's home and would rearrange his environment in such a way as to produce more quiet, better air. We have, of course, some of the understandings coming from the East, where the direction of healing comes from the East, and these energies and so on are very important. But so is stale air. If you don't breathe fresh air, it's a problem. The bugs, the germs, the bacteria breed in stale air. In 984, Ibn al-Jazan was the first pediatrician. And al-Sahrawi was the first surgeon, using all exquisite instruments which we still have, and a 30-volume medical encyclopedia. I'm not sure about anesthesia though. I wonder how they coped. I'll have to look that one up. Sorry I'm leaving you with a question, but be proud of the golden age of Islam. Please come back for our next program.